March 1968, 20,000 feet over North Vietnam, an F-4 Phantom streaks through thin air at 600 miles per hour. Twin J-79 engines scream behind the cockpit, where Lieutenant Commander Dan Peterson watches his missiles miss another MiG. Again, the Navy's most advanced fighter, built to kill at distance with radar and rockets, can't touch the enemy's nimble jets in a turning fight. No internal gun, just speed, weight, and missiles that fail 2 times out of 3. For months, the kill ratio has been brutal, 2-to-1, sometimes worse. The MiG-17s and MiG-21s dance around America's most sophisticated interceptor, like it's standing still. Back at Miramar, the alt report lands on desks with numbers that make admirals wince. The conclusion is simple. The Phantom is fighting the wrong war with the wrong training. But Pedersen sees something else in those failure rates, a pattern that could flip everything. The most lethal weapon in this air war isn't going to be a new missile or a better radar. It's an impossible trick that turns the Navy's gunless jet into a MiG killer. The briefing room at Naval Air Station Miramar fell silent as Commander Frank Alt opened the manila folder that would change everything. March 1969. Outside, F-4 Phantoms taxied past the windows, their twin tails casting shadows across the linoleum floor, where Dan Peterson sat with a dozen other naval aviators, all of them carrying the weight of tours over North Vietnam. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Alt began reading numbers that made grown men shift uncomfortably in their metal chairs. Kill ratio, 2.4-to-1. Alt's voice carried no emotion, but the words hit like artillery. In some engagements, as low as 1.8-to-1, he flipped a page. Missile reliability, AIM-7 Sparrow, 35% success rate. AIM-9 Sidewinder, marginally better at 40%. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. These were the Navy's premier fighter crews, flying the most advanced interceptor in the world, and they were barely staying even with MiG pilots in machines that looked like they belonged in a museum. Pedersen stared at the data sheets, his jaw tightening. He'd flown 67 missions over the North, watched good men die in aluminum coffins, and felt the frustration of launching million-dollar missiles that corkscrewed into empty sky while MiG-17s vanished into the haze. The F-4 Phantom was supposed to be invincible, Mach 2.25 at altitude. Twin General Electric J-79 engines producing 17,900 pounds of thrust each. Radar that could lock targets at 30 miles. But in the turning fights over Hanoi and Haiphong, all that technology meant nothing when a MiG-17 could pull inside your turn radius and put cannon rounds through your cockpit. The enemy adapts, Alt continued, his finger tracing a graph that showed North Vietnamese tactics evolving month by month. MiG-21s now use hit-and-run attacks from below our radar coverage. MiG-17s bait our flights into low-altitude turning engagements, where the Phantom's weight becomes a liability. He looked up from the folder, his eyes scanning the assembled aviators. We're fighting their fight, gentlemen, and we're losing. The institutional response had been predictable. More missiles, better radar, faster jets. The Air Force was already talking about variable geometry wings and look-down, shoot-down capability. Congress was throwing money at supersonic solutions to subsonic problems. But Pedersen had spent enough time in Southeast Asian skies to know that hardware wasn't the answer. He'd seen F-4 crews panic when MiGs appeared at close range, watched pilots launch Sparrows outside their engagement envelope, witnessed radar intercept officers lose track of bogies in the ground clutter. The problem wasn't the jet, it was the jocks. What if we're asking the wrong question? Petersen's voice cut through the post-briefing murmur. Alt raised an eyebrow. Sir, we keep talking about platform limitations, but what if the limitation is training? The room grew quiet again, but this time it was the silence of men considering a dangerous idea. The MiGs aren't better jets, they're just flying better tactics. Alt set down his folder. Go on. We train our crews to fight at 20 miles with missiles, Petersen said, standing up and moving to the tactical chart on the wall. But the real war happens at 2 miles or less, when the missiles malfunction or miss, and suddenly you're in a knife fight with a MiG that's been practicing knife fights since the Korean War. He traced flight paths on the chart with his finger. We send our guys over there thinking the Phantom's speed and radar make them invincible. Then they meet a MiG-17 pilot who knows exactly how to drag them into a slow-speed scissors where 34,000 pounds of American engineering becomes a liability. The idea that emerged from that briefing room would have seemed insane to the Pentagon brass who'd built their careers on technological supremacy. Train American pilots to fight like the enemy. Build a school that would teach Phantom crews to think like MiG pilots, to understand energy management and aspect angles and the deadly geometry of air combat that no computer could calculate. Use smaller, more agile jets as adversaries, Douglas A-4 Skyhawks and Northrop F-5 Freedom Fighters that could mimic MiG performance characteristics. Force American crews to learn the hard lessons of Vietnam in the controlled environment of training rather than discovering them 30,000 feet over enemy territory with surface-to-air missiles tracking their exhaust plumes. The pushback was immediate and predictable: budget constraints, skeptical admirals, a doctrine that had worked against the Luftwaffe and was supposed to work against anyone foolish enough to challenge American air power. Why waste time teaching pilots to dogfight when the next generation of missiles would make close combat obsolete? The F-4 Phantom represented the future of air warfare, beyond visual range intercepts, computer-controlled weapon systems, push-button air superiority. Teaching pilots to turn and burn like World War II aces seemed like a step backward into irrelevance. But the numbers didn't lie. Every month brought more casualty reports, more million-dollar Phantoms converted into smoking craters, more empty bunks in squadron-ready rooms. The MiG pilots weren't reading American tactical manuals. They were writing their own, based on the simple principle that every air battle eventually becomes personal, a contest between human reflexes and situational awareness that no amount of technology can replace. While American crews trusted their radar screens and missile envelopes, North Vietnamese pilots were learning to exploit the blind spots and dead zones that every sophisticated system inevitably creates. On March 3, 1969, the United States Navy Fighter Weapons School opened its doors at Naval Air Station Miramar with 9 instructors and a handful of aircraft that looked obsolete compared to the sleek Phantoms parked on the main flight line. The official mission statement mentioned dissimilar air combat training and weapons systems employment, but everyone understood what they were really trying to do. They were going to teach American pilots to survive in a war that had already proven the experts wrong, using an impossible trick that turned the Navy's greatest weakness into its deadliest strength. The morning sun painted the Miramar flight line gold as Lieutenant Mike Razor Kellerman walked his pre-flight inspection around the F-4 Phantom, its twin J-79 engines still ticking as they cooled from the previous sortie. April 1969, 3 weeks into the new fighter weapons school program, and everything Kellerman thought he knew about air combat was being systematically dismantled by instructors who flew like the enemy and thought like scientists. The Phantom squatted on the tarmac like a 34,000-pound predator, bristling with AIM-7 Sparrows and AIM-9 Sidewinders, but Kellerman had learned that all that firepower meant nothing if you couldn't get into position to use it. "Today we're going to teach you how to die," announced Commander Ron Muggs McKeown, the lead instructor, as he briefed the morning's dissimilar air combat training mission. Behind him, a tactical chart showed altitude bands, speed corridors, and engagement geometries that looked more like mathematical equations than dogfight scenarios. Your adversary will be Lieutenant Commander Dan Peterson in an A-4 Skyhawk, 24,000 pounds versus your 61,000 pounds fully loaded. His thrust-to-weight ratio is 0.67. Yours is 0.58. He can pull 7.5 Gs sustained. You can pull 6.5 before you start bending metal. McKeown's smile was predatory. Any questions about who has the advantage in a turning fight? The genius of the program wasn't just using smaller jets as adversaries. It was the systematic deconstruction of every assumption American pilots brought to air combat. The F-4 Phantom had been designed to kill bombers at long range, not to dogfight with nimble interceptors in the weeds. But over North Vietnam, the rules of engagement often prevented beyond visual range shots, forcing Phantom crews into knife fights they'd never trained for against opponents who lived for close combat. The result was predictable. American pilots died while trying to turn with jets that could outmaneuver them in their sleep. Kellerman's radar intercept officer, Lieutenant Bob Scope Martinez, settled into the rear seat as they strapped in for another lesson in humility. The back seat of an F-4 was a technological marvel: radar screens, electronic countermeasures, weapon systems management. But all that sophistication became academic when a MiG-17 appeared in your rearview mirror at 1,000 feet and closing fast. Martinez had learned to think in terms of energy states and aspect angles, concepts that weren't taught in flight school but meant the difference between going home and becoming a statistic. The Douglas A-4 Skyhawk that lifted off the opposite end of the runway looked like a toy compared to the massive Phantom, but Pedersen flew it like an extension of his nervous system. 24 feet long, 27-foot wingspan, and the heart of a fighter pilot who understood that dogfighting was physics made personal. The A-4 could turn inside the Phantom's radius, accelerate faster from low airspeeds, and climb at angles that would stall the heavier jet. More importantly, Pedersen flew it with the tactical mindset of a North Vietnamese pilot who knew exactly how to exploit every limitation of American doctrine. The engagement began at 20,000 feet, both aircraft climbing toward each other in what the textbooks called a neutral merge. Kellerman's first instinct was to use his radar advantage, to lock up the A-4 at maximum range and fire a Sparrow before the merge became a dogfight. But the rules of engagement for training mirrored those over North Vietnam. Positive visual identification required, no shots beyond visual range unless specifically cleared. By the time Kellerman could see the A-4's distinctive delta wing, they were already too close for missiles, already committed to the kind of fight the Phantom was never meant to win. "Razor, he's going vertical," Martinez called from the back seat as Pedersen pulled the A-4 into a climbing turn that would have torn the wings off a less robust aircraft. The Phantom's twin engines had more raw power, but power meant nothing if you couldn't use it efficiently. Kellerman followed the climb, his airspeed bleeding off as the Phantom's weight worked against him. At 15,000 feet, the A-4 rolled inverted and pulled through toward the deck, using gravity to maintain energy while the Phantom struggled to follow. The fight became a three-dimensional chess game played at 400 miles per hour. Pedersen used every advantage the A-4 possessed: tighter turning radius, better acceleration from low airspeeds, superior visibility from the single-seat cockpit, to systematically demonstrate why the Phantom was losing the air war over Vietnam. When Kellerman tried to use his speed advantage to disengage and reset the fight, Pedersen anticipated the move and positioned himself to cut off the escape route. When Kellerman attempted to use altitude advantage to dictate the engagement geometry, Pedersen went low and forced him to give up his energy state to maintain contact. "Guns, guns, guns!" Pedersen's voice crackled over the radio as he achieved a firing solution from Kellerman's 7 o'clock position, the simulated cannon rounds ending another lesson in tactical humility. The engagement had lasted 3 minutes and 40 seconds. In that time, Kellerman had fired no shots, achieved no advantageous position, and been systematically outmaneuvered by an aircraft that looked like it belonged in a museum compared to his sophisticated interceptor. The debrief was more brutal than the flight. McKeown used gun camera footage and telemetry data to dissect every mistake, every missed opportunity, every moment when physics and tactics conspired to put the Phantom at a disadvantage. "You fought his fight," McKeown explained, freeze-framing the moment when Kellerman had committed to a low-altitude turning engagement. "He got you slow, got you low, and got you dead. The MiG-17 pilots over North Vietnam use exactly the same tactics." But the real education came in understanding why the tactics worked. The F-4 Phantom wasn't a bad aircraft. It was an aircraft being used incorrectly. Its speed and climb rate could be decisive advantages if employed properly. Its radar and missile systems could kill at ranges where lighter aircraft couldn't even detect the threat. The key was learning to fight the Phantom's fight, instead of letting the enemy dictate the terms of engagement. Energy management became the cornerstone of survival, maintaining airspeed and altitude advantage, using the Phantom's power to control the vertical plane, avoiding the slow-speed turning fights where nimble opponents held every advantage. Week by week, sortie by sortie, the Navy's best pilots learned to think like their enemies and fight like scientists. They practiced beam attacks that negated the MiG's turning advantage. They rehearsed vertical maneuvers that used the Phantom's power-to-weight ratio to maximum effect. They drilled communication procedures that kept pilot and radar intercept officer functioning as a seamlessly integrated weapons system. Most importantly, they learned to recognize their own limitations and exploit their opponent's weaknesses instead of trying to outturn jets that were built to turn. The transformation wasn't immediate, and it wasn't painless. Pride died hard when confronted with tactical reality. But slowly, inexorably, the kill ratios began to change as graduates of the fighter weapons school returned to fleet squadrons carrying new doctrine forged in the controlled crucible of dissimilar air combat training. January 8, 1972. Lieutenant Commander Mike Razor Kellerman rolled inverted at 22,000 feet above the Gulf of Tonkin, his FE-4 Phantom's radar painting 2 contacts climbing out of Keep Airfield 40 miles southwest. Operation Linebacker had resumed the previous May after a 3-year bombing halt, and the North Vietnamese were throwing everything they had at the returning American strike packages. But something fundamental had changed in the 3 years since Kellerman's first tour. The Navy crews now carried themselves differently, fought with a precision that came from understanding both their aircraft's capabilities and their enemy's limitations. Razor, I've got 2 bandits bearing 270 at 38 miles, climbing through 15,000, called Lieutenant Tony Scope Rodriguez from the back seat, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through both men's veins. Rodriguez was a fighter weapons school graduate, trained in the radar discipline that had been systematically ignored during the early years of the war. His scope painted a tactical picture that extended far beyond visual range, but he understood that the real fight wouldn't begin until they could see the whites of their opponent's eyes. The contacts resolved into a pair of MiG-21s, silver darts climbing aggressively toward the American formation. Kellerman's wingman, Lieutenant Jim Hawk Patterson, held position 3,000 feet to starboard, both Phantoms maintaining the loose deuce formation that had replaced the rigid finger-4 tactics of earlier years. The fighter weapons school had taught them that flexibility trumped formation discipline when facing opponents who refused to fight by American rules. Bandit 1 is accelerating through 400 knots, aspect hot, Rodriguez reported as his radar tracked the lead MiG's intercept geometry. The North Vietnamese pilot was making the classic mistake of the early war years, closing too fast, burning energy in pursuit of a quick kill. But Kellerman had learned patience in the controlled airspace over Miramar, drilling the same scenario dozens of times until the tactical response became instinctive. At 12 miles, the MiGs became visible as tiny specks against the hazy sky, growing larger with frightening speed. The rules of engagement required positive visual identification before weapons release, but Kellerman held his fire even as his thumb hovered over the missile select switch. Range was life in air combat. Fire too early, and the Sparrow would guide on empty air as the target maneuvered. Fire too late, and the enemy would be inside minimum engagement range, forcing a guns-only fight that favored the lighter, more maneuverable MiG. Fox 1, Kellerman called as he triggered an AIM-7 Sparrow at a range of 6 miles, the missile streaking away on a pillar of white smoke toward the lead MiG-21. But instead of waiting to assess the shot, he immediately began a climbing turn to starboard, using his Phantom's superior thrust-to-weight ratio to gain both altitude and separation. The old doctrine would have had him pressing the attack, closing range for a follow-up shot. The new doctrine emphasized energy management over aggressive pursuit. The lead MiG exploded in an orange fireball as the Sparrow's proximity fuse detonated 15 feet from the cockpit, but the second MiG had already begun defensive maneuvering, turning hard left and descending toward the deck where his aircraft's superior maneuverability would negate the Phantom's advantages. This was where the early war had gone wrong, American pilots chasing MiGs into low-altitude turning fights where their heavier aircraft became flying coffins. "Hawk, take the trailer," Kellerman ordered, maintaining his climb as Patterson dove after the surviving MiG. The two-ship engagement had become a textbook demonstration of fighter weapons school doctrine. Use your strengths, avoid the enemy's strengths, and never fight the enemy's fight when you can dictate your own terms. Patterson's Phantom had the energy advantage from altitude, and he used it to position himself for a high-speed beam attack that would deny the MiG pilot the turning room he needed to survive. At 18,000 feet, Patterson rolled inverted and pulled through toward the MiG, his F-4 accelerating past 500 knots as gravity added energy to his attack. The MiG pilot saw the threat developing and tried to reverse his turn, but physics worked against him. His aircraft's lighter weight that gave him an advantage in sustained turns became a liability in high G reversals, where the Phantom's structural strength allowed it to pull harder without braking. "Fox 2!" Patterson called as he fired an M9 Sidewinder from a range of 800 yards, the heat-seeking missile guiding unerringly on the MiG's twin exhaust plumes. The second kill of the engagement came 37 seconds after the first, both North Vietnamese pilots dead before they understood how completely the tactical equation had shifted since the early years of American involvement. The engagement had lasted 4 minutes and 23 seconds from first radar contact to second kill. In that time, 2 fighter weapons school graduates had demonstrated the lethal effectiveness of properly applied doctrine against opponents who were still fighting the previous war's tactics. No turning fight, no low-altitude chase. No desperation shots with malfunctioning missiles, just cold, calculated application of energy management and weapons employment that left no room for enemy countermeasures. The statistics that emerged from Linebacker operations told a story that would have seemed impossible during the dark days of 1968. Navy F-4 squadrons flying from Yankee Station scored 24 confirmed MiG kills while losing only 2 aircraft to enemy fighters, a kill ratio of 12-1 that represented the complete reversal of early war performance. The transformation wasn't the result of better missiles or upgraded radar systems. The Phantoms flying over North Vietnam in 1972 were essentially the same aircraft that had struggled against MiGs 4 years earlier. The Air Force, flying the same F-4 variants from bases in Thailand, continued to achieve kill ratios closer to 2-1 during the same period, validating the thesis that training and tactics mattered more than hardware specifications. The difference wasn't in the jets or the weapons, it was in the minds of the men who flew them, the systematic understanding of air combat dynamics that had been developed in the controlled environment of dissimilar air combat training. Rodriguez plotted their return course to Yankee Station as Kellerman throttled back to cruise power, both men processing the engagement with the analytical detachment that separated professionals from amateurs. Every decision point would be analyzed in debrief, every tactical choice dissected for lessons that could be passed on to the next generation of naval aviators. The war was far from over, but the fundamental question that had driven the creation of the fighter weapons school had been answered with mathematical certainty. The best weapon in air combat wasn't the fastest missile or the most sophisticated radar. It was the trained mind of a pilot who understood his aircraft's capabilities, his enemy's limitations, and the deadly geometry that connected them across the thin air of high-altitude engagement zones. The F-4 Phantom had finally become what its designers intended, not despite its limitations, but because its crews had learned to transcend them. The ready room aboard USS Constellation fell silent as the casualty report crackled over the ship's communication system. October 15, 1972, Lieutenant Junior Grade Bobby "Kid" Morrison, 22 years old, fighter weapons school graduate, had been shot down by a surface-to-air missile while egressing from a strike on the Paul Doomer Bridge. His F-4 Phantom had disintegrated at 18,000 feet, taking with it both Morrison and his radar intercept officer, Petty Officer First Class David Chen. The war had claimed 2 more lives, but the circumstances of their loss illustrated both the revolution in Navy air combat doctrine and its limitations. Lieutenant Commander Mike Kellerman stood before the memorial wall at Naval Air Station Miramar, reading names etched in black granite that represented the price of tactical evolution. March 19, 1973. The war was winding down, but the lessons carved in blood and aluminum would endure long after the last American aircraft departed Southeast Asian skies. Morrison's name had been added to the wall 2 weeks earlier, alongside Chen's, both men victims not of air-to-air combat, but of the increasingly sophisticated surface-to-air missile threat that had made low-level attack missions suicide runs by the final year of American involvement. The fighter weapons school had solved the air-to-air problem with mathematical precision, but warfare had a way of evolving beyond any single solution. The 12-to-1 kill ratio achieved by Navy F-4 squadrons during Linebacker operations represented complete tactical dominance against North Vietnamese fighter aircraft, but the enemy had adapted by shifting emphasis to surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft artillery. The MiG threat that had driven the creation of dissimilar air combat training had been largely neutralized, replaced by SA-2 guideline missiles that could reach 60,000 feet and SA-3 GOA missiles that filled the medium-altitude envelope with lethal precision. Commander Dan Peterson reviewed the latest tactical intelligence reports in his office overlooking the Miramar flight line, where F-4 Phantoms continued their training sorties against A-4 Skyhawks and F-5 Tiger adversaries. The school he had helped create now graduated 200 naval aviators annually, each carrying the tactical knowledge that had transformed the Navy's air combat effectiveness. But the war that had necessitated that transformation was ending, and questions were already being raised about the relevance of dogfighting skills in an era of beyond visual range missile systems and electronic warfare. The bureaucratic resistance that had initially opposed the fighter weapons school was being replaced by institutional embrace that threatened to corrupt its original mission. Pentagon officials who had once dismissed dissimilar air combat training as an expensive throwback to World War II dogfighting now claimed credit for the Navy's improved kill ratios. Budget requests for advanced simulation systems and electronic adversaries promised to revolutionize fighter pilot training, but Peterson worried that technological solutions would replace the human insights that had made the program effective. The maintenance crews at Yankee Station worked around the clock to keep the F-4 Phantoms mission ready, despite the punishing sortie rates that had characterized the final phases of American involvement. 200 to 300 missions per month flowed through the carrier flight decks, each sortie representing the accumulated tactical wisdom of 4 years of systematic training evolution. The aircraft themselves remained fundamentally unchanged: twin J-79 engines, AM-7 Sparrows, AM-9 Sidewinders, but the men who flew them had been transformed by an understanding of air combat that transcended platform limitations. The Air Force had finally begun implementing similar training programs at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, but their kill ratios remained inferior to Navy performance throughout the Linebacker campaigns. The institutional culture that had initially resisted change proved harder to modify than individual pilot techniques. And Air Force F-4 crews continued to suffer losses that could have been prevented by proper application of energy management and tactical discipline. The contrast validated the fighter weapons school's emphasis on human factors over hardware specifications, but it also highlighted the difficulty of institutional transformation. Kellerman's third combat tour ended in December 1972 with 47 missions over North Vietnam and 2 confirmed MiG kills, both achieved through textbook application of tactics learned in the controlled airspace over Miramar. His survival depended not on superior reflexes or natural flying ability, but on systematic understanding of physics, geometry, and human psychology applied at supersonic speeds 30,000 feet above enemy territory. The transformation from the panicked desperation of his first tour to the cold professionalism of his third illustrated the school's fundamental insight. Air combat was a learned skill, not an innate talent. The final statistics told a story that would influence fighter pilot training for decades to come. Navy F-4 squadrons achieved an overall kill ratio of approximately 10-to-1 against North Vietnamese fighters during the final 18 months of American involvement, compared to the devastating 2-to-1 ratios of the early war years. More importantly, the loss rate to enemy fighters dropped to nearly zero, with most Navy aircraft losses attributable to surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft artillery, or operational accidents rather than air-to-air combat. The human cost remained sobering despite the tactical improvements. Morrison and Chen represented the 437 naval aviators and radar intercept officers lost, during the Southeast Asian conflict, men whose deaths had purchased the tactical knowledge that would protect future generations of fighter crews. Their sacrifice was not meaningless, but it was irreversible, paid in full by young men who had volunteered to fly the most dangerous missions of the war. The memorial service at Miramar drew hundreds of naval aviators, past and present, who understood that tactical superiority was measured in lives saved as well as enemies destroyed. Kellerman stood among them, 43 years old and graying at the temples, carrying the accumulated weight of 3 combat tours and the quiet satisfaction of having survived a war that had claimed so many of his contemporaries. The F-4 Phantom remained a flawed aircraft, too heavy for turning fights, too dependent on unreliable missiles, too complex for field maintenance, but it had become a MiG killer through the application of human intelligence to mechanical limitations. The fighter weapons school would continue long after the last American aircraft departed Southeast Asia. Its mission expanded beyond air-to-air combat to include air-to-ground tactics, electronic warfare, and threat analysis. But its fundamental insight would remain unchanged. The most sophisticated weapon system was only as effective as the human beings who operated it, and those human beings could be trained to transcend the limitations of their equipment through systematic understanding of the tactical environment. The war was ending, but the lessons would endure, written in the flight manuals and tactical doctrine that would guide American fighter pilots through future conflicts, where the enemy might be different, but the fundamental principles of air combat would remain constant. January 12, 1973, Lieutenant Randy Tube Cunningham rolled his F-4 Phantom into a shallow dive 25 miles northeast of Haiphong. His radar intercept officer, Lieutenant Jr., grayed Willie Driscoll, calling out contacts on the scope as North Vietnamese MiG-21s climbed to intercept the retiring American strike package. The last major air battle of the Vietnam War was about to unfold in the thin air above the Gulf of Tonkin, and neither pilot knew they were flying into history. The engagement began like dozens of others during the Linebacker campaigns. American strike aircraft egressing from their targets, North Vietnamese fighters rising to challenge them. The eternal dance of hunter and hunted played out at supersonic speeds. But this intercept carried special significance beyond the tactical situation. Cunningham and Driscoll were both fighter weapons school graduates, their minds programmed with the systematic understanding of air combat that had transformed Navy kill ratios from embarrassing to dominant. More importantly, they were flying the war's final chapter, the last page of a story that had begun with American pilots dying in droves against opponents they didn't understand. Contact, bearing 010, 12 miles, climbing, Driscoll reported as his radar painted the approaching MiGs. His voice carried the calm professionalism that had replaced the panicked radio chatter of the early war years. 4 years of systematic training had taught American crews to think faster than they could react, to process tactical information with computer-like efficiency while pulling Gs that would render untrained pilots unconscious. The MiG-21 that materialized in Cunningham's windscreen was flown by a pilot who represented everything the North Vietnamese Air Force had learned about fighting Americans. Senior Lieutenant Nguyen Van Kock had been flying combat missions since 1965, accumulating 9 confirmed kills against F-4 Phantoms through a combination of aggressive tactics and intimate knowledge of his aircraft's capabilities. He was, in every measurable way, the equal of any American fighter pilot, with one crucial disadvantage. He had never trained against American doctrine as it actually evolved. The merge occurred at 23,000 feet, with both aircraft approaching head-on at a combined closure rate exceeding 1,200 miles per hour. Cunningham's first instinct was to use his Phantom's radar advantage for a beyond visual range shot, but the rapidly decreasing range and the requirement for positive visual identification forced him into the close-range engagement that had favored MiG pilots throughout the early war. The difference was that Cunningham had spent hundreds of hours training for exactly this scenario. Van Kock immediately pulled his MiG into a vertical climb, using his aircraft's superior thrust-to-weight ratio to gain altitude while bleeding Cunningham's airspeed. It was the classic opening gambit of MiG-21 tactics, forced the heavier American aircraft into an energy-depleting climb where its weight disadvantage would become critical. But Cunningham had faced this maneuver dozens of times in training. flying against F-5 adversaries that replicated MiG performance characteristics with lethal accuracy. Instead of following the climb and falling into the energy trap, Cunningham rolled inverted and pulled through toward the deck, using his Phantom's structural strength to execute a high-G maneuver that would have torn the wings off lesser aircraft. The move denied Vancock the altitude advantage he sought while positioning the Phantom for a beam attack that would negate the MiG's turning advantage. It was pure fighter weapon school doctrine, applied with surgical precision at the moment when tactical knowledge meant the difference between life and death. The engagement evolved into a three-dimensional chess match played at 400 miles per hour, each pilot using every advantage his aircraft possessed while denying his opponent the opportunity to exploit their strengths. Vancock attempted to drag Cunningham into a low-altitude turning fight where the MiG's maneuverability would prove decisive. Cunningham used his speed and climb rate to maintain energy advantage while positioning himself for a missile shot. Neither pilot made serious tactical errors, but only one had trained specifically to fight the other's aircraft type. "Fox 2, Cunningham called as he fired an AIM-9 Sidewinder from optimal range and aspect angle, the heat-seeking missile tracking perfectly on the MiG's exhaust signature. Vancock saw the launch and attempted a defensive break, but the geometry was wrong and his energy state insufficient for effective evasion. The Sidewinder detonated 20 feet behind the MiG's engine intake, sending the aircraft tumbling earthward in flames, while its pilot ejected at 3,000 feet. The kill was confirmed at 14:27 local time, marking the final air-to-air victory credited to U.S. Navy forces during the Southeast Asian conflict. Cunningham and Driscoll had achieved their fifth confirmed kill, making them the Navy's only fighter aces of the war. But more significantly, they had demonstrated the complete tactical evolution that had transformed American air combat effectiveness. The engagement lasted 6 minutes and 37 seconds, during which every decision was based on training scenarios practiced hundreds of times in the controlled airspace over Miramar. The broader implications extended far beyond individual achievement. The tactics that Cunningham employed against Vancock had been developed through systematic analysis of thousands of air combat engagements, refined through dissimilar air combat training, and validated through the blood-soaked crucible of Southeast Asian skies. The fighter weapons school had taken the worst kill ratio in modern air warfare and transformed it into the best through nothing more revolutionary than understanding the enemy and training accordingly. The final statistics of the air war told a story that would influence fighter pilot training for generations. From the program's inception in March 1969 through the end of major combat operations in January 1973, Navy F-4 squadrons achieved an overall kill ratio of approximately 12-1 against North Vietnamese fighters. The transformation was so complete that by the war's end, MiG pilots actively avoided engagement with Navy fighters, preferring to attack Air Force formations that had been slower to adopt similar training methodologies. The human cost of this tactical revolution remained sobering. 437 naval aviators and radar intercept officers had been lost during the conflict, their sacrifice purchasing the knowledge that would protect future generations of American fighter pilots. But the alternative, continuing to fight with the inadequate doctrine that had produced 2-to-1 kill ratios during the early war years, would have claimed thousands more lives while achieving far less tactical success. The war was ending, but the lessons would endure. Every fighter weapons school graduate carried with them the understanding that air combat was a learned skill, not an innate talent, and that systematic training could overcome almost any technological disadvantage. The F-4 Phantom had proven that the best weapon in air warfare wasn't the fastest missile or the most sophisticated radar, but the trained mind of a pilot who understood both his own aircraft's capabilities and his enemy's limitations.